Probably relatively low. Egypt is a security partner of the Israelis, has been for 30 years, and they used to control the Gaza Strip between 1949 and 1973, and they hated it. So there's no love lost between the Palestinians and the Egyptians. And while the Egyptians will not say this publicly, they are thrilled with what is about to happen.
No.
Uh, yeah, Jordan is a satellite state of Israel that is basically paid for with international aid, primarily from the United States. So that's not a security threat either. Syria is in a civil war. They don't have the capacity to control their own territory, much less do something at the Golan. That just leaves Lebanon, which is a failed state. And while Hezbollah has some teeth, what they don't have is an army. So they might be able to launch some rockets over, and that might cause some heartburn in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. But it's not a traditional invasion. So, from the Israeli point of view, all of the local states are known quantities. The only questions that matter then are Iran and Saudi Arabia. In the case of the Iranians, they have some missiles that could reach Iran, but nothing that can change the balance of forces on the ground. They certainly can't deploy an army because they'd have to go through Iraq and Syria just to get there in the first place. That's well beyond their capabilities. And then there's Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudis have been pushing for a direct alliance with the Israelis. They've been quiet security partners for the last 20 years. Basically, whenever the United States has said something less than complimentary about the Saudis or the Israelis, the two of them get closer together. And Israel has become a transit point for American weapons technology and training into Saudi Arabia now for quite some time. And they were trying to formalize that relationship. The question now is whether that's still going to move forward. And that is subject to an internal debate within Riyadh that's intergenerational. The King's generation, the older folks, liked the idea of the Palestinian cause and thought that any deal that was going to proceed had to include something for the Palestinians as well. The younger generation, that includes the crown prince, thinks the opposite, thinks that the Palestinians are wastes of skin and just need to be disappeared into history so they can get on with the real work of Saudi power. And so they are now having a debate internally about how seriously to take this. And when they're done with that debate, which will probably be within a month, we're going to have a very firm idea of what Saudi plans are for the next 20 years. Well, keep in mind that the Middle East is run by a series of autocrats. So you've got your political elite, in the case of the Saudis, the royal family, who control all the levers of power. And then you have the street that has to be managed. And obviously, the street is boiling right now. But this isn't the first time this has happened. And it is very, very, very rare that the street can actually overthrow the elite because the elite controls all the security services, all the guns, and generally they have no problem shooting their own people. Also, remember that the street in Saudi Arabia is fat. The national security strategy of most of the Gulf states is to give their people heart disease so they can't protest. And the Saudis have been very, very successful at that. That'll be up to the Israelis. It's going to go one of two directions. Either the Israelis are going to directly occupy it in perpetuity, in which case they will be fighting a series of guerrilla wars against the local population forever, or they clear out Hamas and then go home, rebuild the wall, and Hamas Mark II takes control. Either way, you're looking at a humanitarian disaster for this region for the foreseeable future. One of the fun things about Joe Biden is because he's older than the pyramids, he's seen the long stretch of history here, and he has come to a lot of conclusions about who the powers are worth sticking with over the long term once you just kind of wave the bullshit away. And in his view, Israel, for all of its warts, and there are many, is still the only Western oriented country, is still the only country with the concept of human rights, is still the only country with a modern economy that can look after itself for the most part, is still the only democracy. And while it is flawed by all of those measures, it is better than Egypt or Lebanon or Syria or Jordan. And so if you have to choose, you might as well choose publicly and boldly. And that's exactly what he's done. Will that generate complications down the right line? Yeah, it's going to generate complications tomorrow. But making it very clear where the United States stands and the pecking order of this and other regions, you got to admit it's kind of refreshing compared to the presidents we've had for the last 25 years.
Mm.
Well, the United States has been trying to get out of the Middle East for the last 20 years. We finally pulled it off under Biden. It was a mess with the Afghanistan withdrawal, but it freed up American strategic bandwidth for other things. Biden's now making it very clear that he doesn't really care what happens to the Palestinians, because Israel is the friend, Israel is the family, Israel is the ally. That means that we are going to be in a situation where the street, and to a lesser degree, the elites of this entire region, know exactly where they stand in American eyes. And that is going to force them to take certain policy changes that we're going to perceive as anti American. Now, I would argue that under the surface, we were already there. I mean, let's be honest. Most of the Arab world aren't friendly, and they're certainly not what I would consider pro American. But it's the United States establishing itself as a power broker without being a manager. And the Middle East has not had, I'm sorry, let me phrase it differently. The Middle East has not had this sort of strategic power vacuum for a very long time. It's going to lead to a lot of these smaller powers taking matters into their own hands. That's going to generate a lot more hot conflict. In the case of Israel, that's just an issue for the Palestinians. But for the case of the Saudis, that means all of a sudden they have to seriously consider arming themselves. For the Egyptians, it means that they're kind of on their own, and they're going to also have to make public stances vis-a-vis Israel and show exactly where they stand. It's a bracing moment. And this region has always been a mess. Biden's basically calling it a mess and picking sides. From a train wreck fascination point of view, this is going to get really interesting. No, I haven't seen anything so far that really hurts the United States at this point. In the aftermath of the war on terror, we've got a million-man military that has now had 3 years to rest, recruit, and rearm, absorb the lessons, and get ready for what's next. We're not going to be putting boots on the ground in the Israeli area, certainly not in Palestine. So there's no real issue there. Also, because the United States is not involved in any sort of meaningful conflict at the time, we easily have the capacity of intervening indirectly with military support, special forces, finance, intelligence in a dozen areas at once. So I'm not really concerned at all about limitations on American power at the moment. Now, the idea that China would benefit from crises elsewhere in the world is not one to reject out of hand. Because the idea is if the US is obsessed with this, that, and the other thing, that maybe we'll miss things like Taiwan. But until you actually have boots on the ground, that is not the case. So during the war on terror, it would have been impossible for the United States to engage another part of the world with 100,000 troops because all of our deployable forces were already in play. That's not the case today. So they would have to bait us into multiple hot conflicts where we were actually involved with the shooting. We're nowhere close to that. That's not going to be Ukraine as long as Ukraine is alive. That's kind of piece one. Piece two, I'm not sure the Chinese are capable of even having that conversation internally right now. Chairman Xi has so destroyed the capacity of the Chinese government to even think. He has purged local governments and regional governments and now the academic situation and the business community to such a degree that there is now no one within the Chinese system who will bring him information. This isn't a Trump problem where he doesn't want to be surrounded by people who will speak truth to power. This is more of an Obama situation where he doesn't want to communicate with anyone. And so he is making decisions in the dark based on no information flows. We now know, for example, from the aftermath of that balloon situation, that he didn't even have awareness that the balloon existed until after it was shot down. He has so truncated himself. And so within the Chinese bureaucracy, there's no decision-making capacity except for Xi. And Xi doesn't have the information he needs to make decisions or even be aware that a decision needs to be made. So any Chinese involvement here is a degree legacy from before the information system completely broke down. So if you want to say they're selling weapons to Iran and Iran's sending weapons to Palestine, there might be something to that, but there's no brains behind it. This is just bureaucratic inertia at this point.